Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I am Garrett. I am the host of this series called Cinematic Storytelling, hosted by Litepanels. So thank you so much to Litepanels for putting this on. If this is the first time that you are joining us, say hello in the chat over there. I love to see everybody where they're from and everything. Eric, always good to see you, buddy. Hi to the UK, Midwest. Good to see everybody. So if this is the first time that you are joining us, my name is Garrett. I am a commercial producer and cinematographer with Nice Shirt Media. We do commercial campaigns and video production for brands like Adidas, for Dolby, for all sorts of brands all over the world. And I am taking some of the things that I have learned in my career and I am bringing them, of course, to you all here. So if at any point in time you have questions during today's presentation, two things. One, there is the chat. I try to do my best to look at the chat to make sure that I'm kind of paying attention to what everybody wants. The better way that you can ask a question is using the Q&A module directly built into Zoom. So if you look at the little bar at the bottom, you will see the Q&A module. Punch your questions into there. I have the window up here, and I should be able to answer those questions as we go. I always try to make sure that we have a Q&A time at the end, depending on how long the presentation takes. Of course, depends on how much time we have at the end, but I do like to answer questions throughout. So again, if you have any questions, please pop them in over there, and I will do my best to answer those. Today's format is going to be slightly different than what we normally do. Normally, if you have been here before, we look at an individual project that we have produced with some aspect of filmmaking in mind, and we examine that, we break it down, and we look at that. Today's topic is quite large. We are talking specifically today about camera movement. And so instead of looking at a single project and trying to dissect that, we are going to be kind of talking about video and filmmaking from the perspective of using the camera as a storytelling tool in a much larger perspective. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of different types of shots, explain what they do, how we use them, and how, most importantly, we can use them to benefit us in storytelling. Hello to Scotland and London and the Netherlands. It's good to see you all here. So one thing I just want to mention, the terminology that we're going to be using today is the terminology that's most commonly used in America. There may be some of the terms that we discussed today that might be different regionally, depending on where you are. That said, the movements themselves will be the same, even if the terminology may be slightly different. Now, before we actually look at different projects themselves, the first thing that I want to talk about is our approach to camera movement. I'm sure that many of you have heard the term story is king. And story is king primarily for directors who are, of course, contributing to the narrative of the project. When it comes to cinematography and cinematographers, directors of photography, camera operators, and the entire camera department, we are much less concerned with the story because the story is handled by direction. We are driven by emotion. One of the most simple yet difficult questions to answer for any filmmaker in any department is, when people watch my project, I want them to feel fill in the blank. And I'm not talking about something I want them to feel happy, I want them to feel sad. That's too simple. What I'm talking about is tapping into what we would call universal truths. When somebody watches my project, I want them to feel like they have just climbed Mount Everest, right? Or I want them to feel a deep sense of loss, right? Or I want them to feel, and you fill that in with a core emotion, a deep-rooted, a deep feeling within your narrative, within your subject matter, how you want your audience to feel. And that is the piece that we hold on to when we make our creative decisions on how, when, and why we move our cameras. We don't move our cameras based on convenience. right? I see so many filmmakers just start with a gimbal, and every shot is a gimbal shot, and every shot has a crazy amount of movement, and we're moving in and out and drifting around. That is an incorrect way to think about movement. It's an incorrect way to approach movement. Because it's not intentional. It's not driven by that emotional factor. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other thing I want to talk about is this term that a colleague of mine, I don't know if he created it or it's the first time I heard it, is this idea of floating eyeball syndrome. And when we do our jobs correctly as filmmakers, and specifically as cinematographers, if we do our job right, our audience at some point in the viewing experience stops existing in the movie theater, stops existing in their living room, stops existing watching their phone, and they become immersed in the stories that we're telling, right? They become a pair of floating eyes. This is why we call it floating eyeball syndrome. So when we do our job correctly, our audience no longer is an audience, but they are an active participant within the story that we're crafting and that we're telling. That is why it is so important that we make decisions on how we move the camera based from a narrative standpoint instead of based off of a convenience standpoint. The same is true with lensing. We're not really going to get into lens theory today, but the idea is the same for cinematographers, right? You don't put on a long lens just because you're filming a tight shot. You don't put on a wide lens just because you're filming a wide shot. You can shoot a wide shot with a telephoto lens, and you can shoot a close-up with a wide lens. We choose what lens we use for what project, what shot, what character, what emotion we're trying to convey solely based on the narrative. We don't lens based on convenience, just like we don't move the camera based on convenience. We can get into lens theory another time, but that is another part of this. So when we're thinking about this holistically, of course, the first thing we want to make sure that we're doing is that we are approaching this from a place of using emotion or tone. Sometimes you'll hear cinematographers call it atmosphere, right? We are creating the sense or the world in which our audience belongs. And if we do that well, that's how we get that floating eyeball syndrome. The third point here in our approach to movement, how we think about movement, is creating a sense of depth, right? We're not showcasing our work in 3 dimensions. We are projecting or illuminating on a flat plane. And as such, we have to be the one to create that illusion of depth. We have to be the one to create that sense that the world that we're showing them on the screen is as real and as vibrant and as 3-dimensional as the world in which they live. And that is done through something called parallax, which again, we'll talk about later. But the general sense of parallax is that the closer something is to the audience, right? The lens there, right? The closer something is, the more dramatic the movement is, and the further away from your lens is, the less dramatic that movement is. So if you're driving in the car, the signs along the side of the road or the highway are whipping by the car really quickly, where the mountains off in the distance appear not to be moving at all. That is because we're living in 3 dimensions, and that effect is called parallaxing. And we can recreate that effect with our camera using movement correctly or properly. But in order to create that sense of dimension, to create that sense of depth, we need to add some dynamicy to our camera. We need to create a sense of movement with our camera that doesn't distract our audience from the world building that we're doing, but invites them in and brings them into the world that we're creating. Okay? So those are kind of some of the key principles. The last thing in our approach to cinematography or camera movement is one that I teach my students in the cinematography class that I teach, and I call it the unwritten character. Okay. And this approach is something that isn't universal. This is just the way that I approach things, but it should be a helpful tool for how you think about camera movement. Our audience only sees the worlds that we're building, only sees the creative that we're creating, only sees the narrative that we're showcasing through the eyes of the lens. That's it. They don't get to see what we're not showing them. They don't get to understand what's happening when they're not physically seeing it. And as such, if we're using emotion as kind of the big sieve by which we're making our creative decisions, if we treat the camera as a character, as real as the characters written on the pages of our scripts, it can help inform the movement that we choose to use. So if you think about your camera as being a character as real as the subjects in your projects, how would that person react to what's happening? How would that person feel about the things that they're seeing? Where would that person be in relationship to the action that's taking place? And if we think about our camera as a character, even though the character is not written into the script, it can help us as cinematographers, as directors of photography, camera operators, anybody who's in the camera department. It can help us start to strategize and to start to think about how, why, and when we move the camera. Because if we are using a character as our anchor point for that, that is going to help our audience get to that floating eyeball syndrome, because we're creating a world that is so immersive that the perspective that they're experiencing our film through is going to be such that they're going to be able to exist within that space. Okay. So I wanted to kind of talk about this first before we got into the rest of this, solely because this should dictate everything else that we talk about today. This is our approach to camera movement. Now, before we can go into more of a deep dive on thinking about why we move the camera, the first thing that we need to talk about is how we move the camera. And the first piece to this is going to be tripod-based movement, right? Or what we would call fixed camera movement. And this is where we have our camera locked on a tripod. Quick note here before we get into this. A tripod, hands down, should be the first piece of camera movement that you invest in. You should have a good tripod before you have a gimbal. You should have a good tripod before you have a slider. You should have a good tripod before you get a jib or a dolly or a crane or any of the other ways that we can move the camera. If we don't have a good tripod, we're not going to get the most basic of movement, right? So Sockler is my preferred brand. I'm a big fan of Sockler tripods. I love their Active Head series, but even their FSBs, any of their stuff that they've got going on, Sockler is great. Manfrotto, another really, really good one. If Sockler is a little bit out of your price range, Manfrotto makes a whole line of fantastic tripods as well. But there's two parts to a tripod. There are the sticks, which are the legs, and then there is the head, which is the part that actually moves. You want to make sure that you are getting a video tripod. There are tons of photo tripods out there. Photo tripods are made for photography, which is quick set, shoot, quick set, shoot. It's not how we are in cinematography. So generally what you are going to be looking for is a tripod set, which is going to be the sticks and the head, and you're going to be looking for a fluid head tripod. A fluid head tripod is going to be something that's going to give you the ability to create all of this fixed camera movement that we're about to talk about and make it effortless, to make it smooth, to make it even. If we cheap out on tripods, we don't get ones that are worth the investment. Our movement is going to have a hitch to it where it's not going to be as smooth as it could be. It might not even be sturdy or stable enough to hold the camera locked in place. So tripod, hands down, the first thing that we should be investing in. The first shot we're going to talk about is a static shot. This is also called a locked shot or a locked off shot. So if you're static, locked, or locked off, this is what it's referring to. This is where the camera has no movement at all, and we allow the action to take place in front of the camera. There are a couple of ways, or a couple of reasons rather, that we would use something like this, right? So when we talk about this, you can see here it's listed as importance here. So again, it provides stability. It's an anchored perspective. It allows the audience to focus on the thing that's happening in front of it. You can use static and locked off shots for dialogue. You can use them for establishing shots. You can use them for comedic effect. You can use them to create a sense of symmetry. Wes Anderson is a huge proponent of static shots. He has a lot of movement in his work too, but Bob Yalman does really do a great job with creating a sense of static. When you don't have any camera movement, you're just allowing the audience to experience what's happening on screen. So one of the things that we can use that for is when we want our audience to have to live in the moment with our subject, right? So if we're creating a sense of tension, if we're creating a sense of boredom, if we're creating a sense of time passing slowly, by forcing our subjects to live in a shot for a length of time, and we don't allow them to have any of that movement that gives them that sense of dimension, it very quickly and very easily adds to that emotional underpinning that we're trying to create. Okay? That's just one of many uses. So in the example that we've got here, this is for comedic effect. We have our subject in the foreground backing up, and then he falls into a hole, right? You can do all sorts of things with that, but this is hands down the anchor for building our camera movement on. We're going to talk about more later in terms of the value of mixing between movement and non-movement, or motion and static, but this is where we start, is with our static locked off shot. The next one is a zoom shot. Now, a zoom is different than some of the tracking, trucking shots that we're going to talk about a little later. This is where the camera maintains its position. It stays in place, and we use a zoom lens to change the field of view of what we're looking at here. So again, we're not introducing any sort of camera movement. We're still fixed and locked, but we are zooming in on our subject. And we could do a lot of things with this. Primarily what you're going to see zooms used for is to draw attention to something. So it could be that you're drawing attention to an expression, right, or an action or a reaction. You could be drawing attention to what we would call a MacGuffin, right, or an object that's going to be important later on in the narrative. Zooms are something that we would use fairly sparingly. There are directors who really like to utilize zooms, so you would get like Guy Ritchie, Edgar Wright, Quentin Tarantino. Those are three that will use zooms stylistically in a lot of their work, but the purpose of a zoom is primarily to draw our attention into something, to invite our audience into something. But again, because we're in a fixed position, because the camera is not moving, it's not changing any of our perspective. It's not going to change any of our depth. It's not going to give us any of that parallax. It's just going to stay exactly where it is. Okay. The third shot that we're going to talk about here is a pan shot. Now, this one's a little bit different because this is an overhead pan, but it gives you the idea. A pan shot is the first time that we're actually introducing camera movement into our fixed camera movement here. And the way that this works is that you would have your camera mounted onto a tripod, and then you are going to move that camera laterally. Okay, so or horizontally here. Pans oftentimes will get used in reveals. So if we're going to be bringing a character from one place to another place, a pan can carry that action in, especially if we're using that to track. This again, of course, is a great way of resetting the line. If you guys are familiar with the 180-degree rule or jumping the line, a pan shot is another way of, again, getting us from one place to another place to reset that line really well. A couple of things to note when we're using pan shots, because now we're talking about actually introducing motion into this. We don't want our pans to happen too quickly. Now, there is such a thing as a whip pan, right? And a whip pan, as the name implies, is where the camera whips, right? Movement side to side. But generally speaking, especially when we're talking about people who are filming with DSLRs, with mirrorless cameras, and with like entry-level hybrid cinema cameras, those cameras all have varying degrees of rolling shutter built into them, meaning that as we move the camera on our horizontal axis, straight lines will start to bend, right? They'll start to give you that jelloing effect or a rolling shutter effect. So the slower we make that movement happen, the less prone you are to rolling shutter. But more importantly, we're not going to confuse our audience. Our audience is still going to be able to visually understand what we're doing. Okay, so pan shot is something that gets used a lot, but generally when we're using it, it's to get us from one place to another place or to introduce us into a new place from where we were. Okay, so again, a very anchored position allows us to move through a space and still be able to understand visually where we're supposed to be. All right. The next one that we've got, similar to our pan shot, this one is a tilt. The difference between a pan and a tilt is merely the direction in which we are moving the camera's perspective. So instead of moving it horizontally, we are now moving that perspective vertically, right? So the camera's still in a fixed position. It's just changing its vertical perspective. This, like pans, used for a lot of the same reasons. Reveal shots are a huge one that we would use tilts for, to get us kind of from one place to another place or to introduce us into a space. Now, where we would use this instead of a pan would be if we're introducing a place that has large scale to it, right? So if we think about like, a bank heist, or we think about somebody who's applying for a new job in a skyscraper, right? Where we actually want to show the volume and scale, where we actually want to, again, create a sense of where we are has kind of an imposing feeling onto our subjects. That is a place where tilts make a lot more sense than pans. By the way, all of these movement types that we're talking about are isolated movement types, meaning that it's just movement in one direction. Quite often in filmmaking, we will combine movement types. So sometimes it will be a push in and a tilt down, right? So it's kind of a motion like that, right? Or we'll have a zoom out and a dolly in, which is going to give us that dolly zoom effect, or that Hitchcock vertigo effect, right? So we're going to look at these independently, but again, we can stack them as we want to as we move on here. This is where we start to have some fun, is when we get into this. This is a roll. Now, the difference between a roll shot versus a tilt or a pan is that the perspective does not change horizontally or vertically, but rotates on the yaw, right? Which is going to be our side to side. The easiest way, by the way, when you're starting out to get a roll effect is to mount your camera on your tripod sideways. So generally speaking, you have your tripod head, the camera sits on top of the head. That's what gives us all of that movement. If we take the tripod head and we go horizontal with the camera like this, now as the tripod head is tilting, it's going to adjust that yaw for us, okay? There are very specific camera rigs or mounting rigs that you can use that are specifically designed for rolls. But we generally use rolls so infrequently, especially if you're an owner-operator. There's no reason to invest in something that is a roll-specific movement mechanic when you can get a very similar effect using the tripod that you would already have. But getting back to this, it's a really, really cool way of moving the camera, but where the other two movement types that we've talked about before still give us a sense of stability, because we are moving the horizon line, either clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on what we're doing, it is going to give us a sense of instability or unease or a sense of betrayal, right? So one way that you see those types of movements used often is when we have the reveal of like a double agent, right? Somebody who we thought was good and then is revealed to be working with the antagonist of the film instead of the protagonist, right? As we're revealing that they are not who they appear to be, we can we can roll the camera a little bit at a time through that reveal to, again, give that audience that sense of uneasiness or unsteadiness to the thing that we're looking at. But again, all three of these movements, pans, tilts, and rolls, are all still very controlled and very slow movements. One of the things that I see filmmakers do, especially when they're starting early in their career, is that we try to move the camera a lot, very quickly, all the time. And that can become very disorienting for a viewing audience. And it actually is going to hurt the overall aesthetic of our film, because we're not going to be able to focus on the performances of our talent. We're not going to be able to exist in the spaces that we're creating with our set design or our art direction. We're not going to get a good appreciation for the lighting. We're actually doing a disservice to the larger narrative by creating a chaotic visual. Okay, so as we're going through and we're looking at all of these are all still very controlled and very maintained movements, okay? So those are what we call our fixed camera movements. And if we look at this here real quick, right? So we have a tripod here locked down, right? For our fixed camera movements, which are cameras here, we're not leaving this position. We're not introducing any other equipment. We're not introducing any other gear, right? Our pan shot just changes our perspective along this axis. Our tilt shot just goes up and down and changes our view on our vertical axis, right? And our roll changes our view on our yaw, right? Or on the horizon line. But we have not moved this at all. Now, we can use a combination of pans and tilts, sometimes rolls, but primarily pans and tilts, to create follow shots, right? So a follow shot would be, okay, let's say that I have a character in room number one, and we are then going to go step outside, right? I might have the shot originally focused on my subject's face, and then I'm going to track that subject or follow that subject through and then out the door. So it's going to be a tilt because we're going to start up and then work our way down and outside. And then of course it's a pan as well, because we're starting on camera right and moving to camera left. So that combination there of doing a follow shot, you can very easily do with a fluid head tripod. If you try to do something like that with a photo tripod, you're going to have a very, very bad time. So don't do that. Fluid head tripod all the way. And don't overestimate or don't underestimate the power of having movement on sticks. You don't need anything else to create compelling movement. That's where we start. The next series of movements that we're going to be talking about are directional movements, right? So this is where we're actually going to begin to physically move the camera. And we're going to start with a truck. Now, there in America, we call these tracking shots. There are two different kinds. A truck shot is a shot that moves horizontally side to side. So where a pan, the camera is fixed and rotates side to side. This is we're physically moving the camera through the space side to side. And it doesn't matter which direction. It could be left or right. It doesn't matter. Again, this is where we start to introduce parallaxing. If you look in this example shot here, we're coming out from behind the wall. The wall is moving very quickly, and we're kind of now into the room that we have these two folks sitting in watching a show. So we can follow characters with it, that's fine. But where we actually really excel with these is when we want to explore a location, where we want to start entering that kind of dynamic movement or adding that dimension to our visuals, because this is what creates that sense that we're living in a 3D space. But again, this truck, like with the pan, is still a very controlled and moving shot. Okay. You'll see here in all these slides, we've got a lot of info here in terms of the narrative function, when to use them, when not to use them. These are all very, very important things. And you can go through when this is uploaded on YouTube and dive into all of that stuff. We're blitzing through these because we've got a lot of material to go through, but a trucking shot is one of my favorites in conjunction with a dolly shot. Okay, so a dolly shot is exactly the same as a truck, but instead of physically moving the camera along the horizontal plane, we are moving it along the Z axis, right? Or moving in and out. So we would call this a dolly in or a dolly out, depending on what direction you're trying to go for. So for this example here, which if you want to go see this production here, this was from the episode on how to light with natural lighting. This was for the reveal of the young kid there that's on the side of the frame, along with these yard flamingos. So a dolly out is a great way of revealing the world that's around our subject, because again, we're starting really narrow, and then as we start to open up, we can start to get a bigger sense or a better sense for the larger world. As we dolly in, right, like a zoom, of course, it is going to draw our attention into a specific place or into a specific area. The difference, of course, being that we're going to be getting that parallax. We're going to be getting that sense of a dimension with a dolly that you would not with a zoom. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can create that sense of zoom here. So if we go back to this, if you have a really, really lightweight camera, like a mirrorless camera, DSLR camera, some of your hybrid cameras, you can throw those on little sliders, right? So a little slider is just something that would be mounted directly onto your tripod, right? So if you had your little Sockler tripod or your Manfrotto tripod here, you could get a slider like something from Syrup, and you'd then be able to mount that camera and physically move that camera down your slider, right? Or we just change the position of it, and now we can have the camera move in on that slide. If you're going to use a slider for dolly shots, whether you're dollying in or dollying out, it is important to note that you're going to have a certain limited range of motion, because the further out you get, you definitely want to make sure you're not seeing the front half of that slider. Now, as you get into larger cameras and further movement, you would then move from a slider to a dolly. A couple different kinds of dollies that you have available to you. First of all, dollies, much larger movements and much heavier payloads. So depending on what you're trying to do, sometimes those make sense. A Dana dolly is something that we use here a lot, which is just basically a little camera cart on speed rails, and you just are able to move those as far as the rails that you have them. So, 4, 6, 8, 12 feet, easy to kind of move through and in. Then we have two types of large scale dollies, which are things that your camera operator would probably be sitting on, and those are track dollies and trackless dollies. I'm sure if you've looked behind the scenes of any film, you'll see like the camera operator sitting on like a little, it almost looks like a golf cart with no roof on it, right? And it's sitting there and it's on rails moving around. Fisher dollies get used all the time for that kind of stuff, or doorway dollies if you're going with track or trackless dollies. But those are for much, much, much larger movements that you're trying to do when you're really trying to give people a sense of scale and space. So sliders, great place to start. Dollies would be something that kind of as you are scaling up or need larger movement, you would get into those. Now, next one, we call it a booming shot or a pedestal shot. And just like with our trucks and with our dollies, a boom shot physically moves the camera along our y-axis, right? It is where we start high and we come down low. And because we are physically changing the perspective of the camera on this kind of vertical plane, most of the time you're going to see these be used as opens and as closes, as establishing shots and as clincher shots. And the person who probably uses them most prolifically is Steven Spielberg. Most of the work that Steven Spielberg does when we enter into a movie or a space or a scene, right, or we're going through a dramatic location shift, he will then have us boom into a shot or pedestal into a shot to get us into that space, and then at the end it'll have us come out of that shot, right? Forrest Gump is a huge example of that, where we start coming in and we leave going out, right? That is primarily where you're going to see those kind of boom shots used. The other place you can see them used is if we're starting to shift power in a conversation, right, where we want to empower somebody. We can move the camera up with them. If we want to make somebody feel weak, we can bring the camera down with them. But for that, we're going to be using either a crane or a jib. or a jib crane. But those are the two mechanics that are going to physically move that camera up and down. If you invest in a slider, which I think that in terms of building camera movement, that's a really, really good place to start. You can mount your slider on a semi-vertical axis, right, by mounting it on your tripod head, and then you can actually get some of that same movement that you would from using a crane or a jib. So if you're on a budget and you're just kind of starting to build your camera kit, your camera movement kit, a slider is a great place to start because you can get your truck shots, your dolly shots, and to a certain degree, some of your boom or pedestal shots. But primarily, you're going to see those boom and pedestal shots used as getting into a space or leaving a space. The last one for this is going to be what we would call an arc shot or an orbit shot. And what this is where the camera is moving through a space on a curve, and it is leaving the subjects of our shot in the same framing. Okay, and the way that we achieve that is by, so if we have our subjects here, right? So we have a person here like this, we would have a track that would actually have a curve to it like this, right? And our camera would truck down this rail, right? So instead of a dolly or a slider having a straight line, by having a curved line like this, it allows the camera to move along that track while still maintaining the same perspective on our subjects. Some sliders have both the what they would call a parallax or a curved section as well as a straight. Your dollies, like your track dollies, will have curves to them. Sometimes you can use something like a Steadicam or a gimbal and get that same kind of orbit shot. Michael Bay is a huge fan of orbit shots. He uses them all the time in most of the projects. But when we would use this is the important piece here. This is something that we use to emphasize importance. Something is happening where everything else that's going on in the scene or in the world is far less important than the thing that's happening right in the center of the shot. So this is something that is a very extreme and very dramatic way of drawing attention to the focal point that we're looking at. So an example of this, which just pick a Michael Bay movie or any of the Fast and Furious movies, when all hope is lost and everything is going badly and our heroes are at an impasse, right? All of a sudden, we have the Deus Ex Machina moment where we have somebody come in or something that comes in to then save the day. And when we have like the big guy that comes in to save the day, and all of a sudden he's now beating the bad guys without an issue, that is when you would use a shot like that of like, okay, this is the thing that's changing everything that we just looked at. This is the most important thing to happen in that moment. That's an extreme example, but that gives you an idea of when we would use something like this. Again, this is something that we use as an emphasis. Think about this from a grammatical perspective. This is an exclamation point, right? This is the thing of this is the most important thing in that moment, okay? So that was dynamic camera movement. Now we're getting into free roaming camera movement. And this is where people usually like to start with their camera movement, but this is where you should end. This is the icing on the cake. This is once we have all of the foundations built, this is when we can lean on these things. And it starts with our aerial shots, okay? Aerials have never been easier to get than they are right now because drones have become so unbelievably affordable. Depending on where you are, not only in the world, but in the country, in the region, in the state, make sure that you check your local laws and, of your municipalities of when, where, how, why, and what is required for flight. Don't just get a drone and start flying around. You could very well find yourself in a load of trouble. So in America, we are required to have a 107's pilot license or a grounds pilot's license, and that is the thing that you would need to have if you're going to be flying drones for commercial use or for profit. If you're doing a project that you're getting paid for, you need to have a trained pilot for that. Not hard to get, but something that you need to get. Okay, so aerial shots, another thing that we use for establishing, another thing that we can use for showcasing scale. This is another great thing that we can use for follow shots. You'll see aerial shots used a lot in those three circumstances. It's really, really nice from the perspective of getting multiple camera angles, multiple camera framings, and then so that way you not only have your wides to tights, but you can also get extreme wides. But again, the purpose of this, similar to a tilt, but on a much more extreme level, is to showcase scale. The world that you are now living in is huge. This is how big that world is, right? And it doesn't have to be massive stuff like this, right? Like these are taken from very high up, from very far away, and the world looks very, very small. They don't have to be that big, that far, that high, but that is narratively how we would use those, okay? This, of course, you wouldn't throw in an aerial shot over a dialogue sequence, right? You wouldn't use these necessarily as a direct narrative. These are things that are world building, right? These are the things that we would then create with. This is the scale of the world, okay? Now, next one. This is where most people feel like they need to start with camera movement, but this is a very specialized type of movement, and this is gimbal or Steadicam. Now, before people come yelling at me in the comments here, gimbals and Steadicams are quite different, and they can achieve very different aesthetics between those two pieces of hardware. I do not mean to conflate them in terms of what the capabilities of each of them are. That said, a lot of the functional use case for them is going to be quite similar. Gimbals are generally used for smaller camera builds. Your DSLRs, your mirrorless cameras, and your hybrid small cinema cameras will all be able to fly on gimbals. And gimbals, of course, are far more affordable than Steadicams. But the way that we use them is going to be very, very similar, okay? The biggest mistake that folks who get gimbals use is that they use them for fast-paced, quick-cut shots. Gimbals and Steadicams are most effectively utilized when we are doing long takes, when we are doing oneers, when we are following characters in sequence, when we are existing and living with characters through a space. Again, like with the rest of our movements, the faster your movement is, the more chaos you are injecting into your story. And the more chaos you're injecting into your story, the harder it is for your subjects to follow. So while these are some of the coolest types of movement, some of the most immersive type of movement that we create or can create, this is something that if we want to do it correctly, if we want to create that sense of floating eyeball syndrome, we want to use it properly. An absolute masterclass in Steadicam work for a narrative function is in season 1 of True Detective. Disclaimer, it's a dark show, but season 1 of True Detective is incredible. There is a near 6-minute oneer that I believe had over 80 extras and a helicopter and a bunch of police cars and whatever, but it forces you to live in that moment with those characters as you're moving through a space. And while the subject matter is chaotic, the movement being as anchored as it is really gives you a good sense of placement and a good sense of drama for that. This is another thing that the John Wick series, if you're into action movies, has done an incredible job of, is creating a really high impact visual that's happening while still having very anchored movement narratively to force the audience to live in that space with what's happening on camera. Okay. Next one we've got is what we would call float. Okay. This is generally what you're going to see with shoulder rigs, right? So, or ENG style stuff. This is where we want to have a lot of the same framing, narrative interest that we would with locked off or static shots, but we do want to add a sense of dynamicy to our shots. This is not shooting handheld. We're going to talk about handheld in just a second, but float is a very controlled, very soft, very subtle way of moving the camera. Instead of a tripod being your anchor for your pans, your tilts, or your rolls, you, the camera operator, become that anchor. And no matter how smooth you try to be, no matter how locked off you try to be as the human, it's not going to be as locked off as your tripod would be. So it is a great way of creating and maintaining that sense of engagement where you may not want to have something totally static or locked off. You can, I mean, it says here when not to use, and it's the high action scenes. This again goes to the difference between how fight scenes were filmed in like the Bourne Identity series, which is what kind of launched this whole super handheld, chaotic, fast camera movement, versus something like the John Wick series, which is a much more stabilized movement. You can. The reason why I encourage filmmakers, especially when they're earlier in their careers, to avoid high chaos shots is because it forces you to think about things narratively. It forces you to think about things creatively. It forces you to get outside of the box of convenience and to really focus on how can we use the camera to tell compelling stories. So if you're going to use float, right, and you're going to use something like a wooden camera shoulder rig, right, you can absolutely do that. But two things when you're doing that, make sure that you always maintain 3 points of contact, which would be shoulder and 2 arms, right? And then make sure your elbows are tucked into your body so that way you can actually use the core of your body as further stabilization for those shots. And then you go through and you get your movement that way, right? That's going to make sure that you can have the movement that you want without that movement becoming distracting. Our camera movement should never distract from the narrative story that we're trying to tell, okay? Now, the last one, and this is other than gimbals, this is people's favorite one, which is always going to be I'll move down here, our handheld shots, okay? Rarely, if ever, do we shoot the camera naked, meaning that there's no form of rigging or stabilization on the camera. Very, very, very rarely do we just hold a camera and film. It introduces a ton of shake. It introduces a ton of movement into what we're doing, right? If we are trying to create a sense of intensity, or create a sense of chaos or rawness in terms of emotion, it's a great way of doing it. But again, you can see in this shot here, it's handheld, there's a lot going on, but if you look at the trees in the background, even though I am hand holding this camera and we have a lot of movement happening, right, where we have our actor falling in and out of frame, right, we're tracking with them, but they're going kind of all over the place, we still have a good sense of control, okay? So it's okay to add chaos. It's okay to add that sense of intensity or urgency into our shots if it makes sense narratively. But even when we do, even if we go handheld, if that's what the story dictates, we need to make sure that it is a controlled chaos, that people are able to identify what they're looking at, right? This is the same reason why we don't shoot with a super, super narrow depth of field, because we don't want our subject falling in and out of focus. Our audience should always be able to know what's going on. They shouldn't get lost in what we're doing. Because again, if we're trying to achieve floating eyeball syndrome, and if we're treating our audience and we're treating our camera as a character, an unwritten character in our film, them getting lost in what we're doing defeats the entire purpose. We need to make sure that they feel grounded, that they feel the emotion that we're trying to go for, and that they visually understand what we're trying to show them. Which takes us to our basic rules for movement, okay? First one, this is a little term it's not a real word, I don't think, but it's one that I use all the time. Most important thing for cinematography, if we are correctly using emotion as our narrative driver for our decisions, is pausability. Your audience should be able to pause your movie, pause your commercial, pause your documentary, music video, whatever, at any moment and visually understand what they're looking at. Okay, this is a thing that I see happen a lot with YouTubers and YouTube culture, is that they create movement to the detriment of the project, to where there is so much movement that I spend more time not knowing what I'm looking at than what I am looking at. And if you are filming in a way where you do not have pausability, where you do not have a very easy to understand visual aesthetic throughout your project, you are going to lose your audience, right? Really cool stuff happening on YouTube, really cool camera movement happening on YouTube, but it lives and dies on YouTube. There's a reason that that style does not transcend into television, into film, into narrative work, into commercial work. We want our audiences to live in the worlds that we're creating and not get thrown around and get whiplash by the camera movement that we're doing, because that camera movement becomes distracting. Okay, so make sure that we have good pausability. Now, second rule to camera movement here: opposites don't attract. And what I mean by that is that if we are moving from in one direction, right? So if we're moving, if we have a pan that's left to right, if we have a tilt that's up to down, if we have a dolly push that's in, the next shot cannot or should not have the opposing movement, which means if I have one shot that's pushing in, my next shot should not be pulling out. If I have a shot that's tilting up, my next shot should not be tilting down. Those opposites, right? Trucking side to side, right? Those opposites become quite visually jarring. Because again, if you think of our audience as our camera as eyeballs, right? We want to make sure that we constantly have this really nice flow that's happening through our project, and we're not just jerking them around all over the place with where they need to pay attention and how they need to exist. If you need to move from one direction to the other direction, that's fine. But we need to make sure that we bring the camera to a rest before we do so, right? So we have our pan, we're going left to right, come to a rest to center, cut to the next shot, and we have that movement. That rest in the middle is going to give our audience time to reestablish themselves before we introduce an opposing movement. Now, you can go from movement to movement, absolutely, but it just can't be opposite. So we can have a tilt down, and then the next shot is a truck to the right. We can have a truck to the right, and the next shot to push in. We can have a push in, and the next shot be stationary, right? We can introduce movement to movement without an issue. We just have to make sure that those movements aren't in direct opposition one to another, because we don't want to give our audience whiplash, okay? Now, building image systems. This is kind of more in terms of framing and blocking than it is in movements, but it is important nonetheless when we are creating the visuals for characters, right? And how we want a character to live in that world. If they're a chaotic character, we might want how we portray that camera visually to have more movement. If we want somebody to be the anchor point to our team, we might have them be a little bit more anchored visually, right? We can create those, but in terms of creating image systems, how we lens and how we frame them is also very, very important. There's a fantastic book if you want to learn more on compositional theory and when and why we use different shot types and that kind of thing. The Filmmaker's Eye is a fantastic book. They're on their second edition right now. It's got Keanu Reeves on the cover. It's not an expensive book, but it is a fantastic book for understanding and breaking the rules of cinematography, and creating image systems is one of the first things that they talk about in that book. The last thing in terms of the basic rules of motion are rules are made to be broken. If you have a good narrative reason to make the audience jarred from one side to the other, opposites might attract for that. Right? If you do want to have a sense of the audience getting lost and not understanding what's going on, you might want to use more handheld. But all of those decisions should be made narratively and not by convenience. Okay? So When we approach camera movement, when we talk about camera movement, those are the movements that you have available to you or combinations therein. But how you move the camera is less important than why you move the camera. We make those decisions because of how we want our audience to feel, by how we want the story to be told, by how we convey the world building that we're doing, and far less on, well, let's just line up the shot and get it, right? That's not going to contribute to the overall story. So that is a crash course. We could spend 15 hours talking about it and breaking down different scenes of different movies and things and all of that. But that is a crash course, not just in how we move the camera, but in why we move the camera. We have just a couple of minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, this would be the time to punch those into the Q&A. If you have not yet checked out the rest of this series, we have cinematic storytelling. Last session was on utilizing AI in filmmaking. It was super cool. The series we did before this was professional lighting techniques, where we talked about how to light various types of setups that filmmakers find themselves in. And then before that, we did a series on effects and using lighting effects to help convey those stories. If you're interested in any of that stuff, you should follow Light Panels on YouTube. They have all of these live streams up on their YouTube channel. There's a wealth of content in there. It's been a ton of fun to do all of this stuff. So do make sure you check that out there. And then again, they just put a link in the chat for the next live stream to register for that. The next one we're going to be talking about is going kind of back into lighting and filmmaking and how to work on location. On location meaning when we're in a space that we may or may not have power, where we need to then be able to set up all of our own gear and all of our own lighting and all of our own camera stuff when we may not have access to that, and how we can use those types of locations creatively. So make sure you register for that, because I want to see you guys there. Do check out all of the past stuff. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns between now and the next session, go follow me on Instagram. That's where I am most active. You can find me on Instagram. It's just my name, so it's just Garrett Salmons. So DM me there. I try my best to be active on that. So if you have comments, questions, things you guys want to talk about, suggestions for future live streams, that's where you will find me there. There's a link in that in the chat for that. So if there are no other questions, it has been an absolute pleasure. I am looking so forward to the next one that we have going on. Thanks again to Light Panels for hosting this chat. And I will see you all next time. Bye.